The protagonists of Final Fantasy are some of the most iconic in video game history, up there with the likes of Zelda, Dark Souls, some of Nintendo's greats. But in my opinion, not all Final Fantasy protagonists were made equal, so let's put them in a tier list and see where they lie. Before we get started, this tier list is designed purely as a fun topic for discussion, and I fully expect that people will disagree with me on the placement I have for some of these characters, but in my eyes, that's a good thing, and the purpose of this video is to create discussion. So if you want to comment, fully encourage you to do so, and I'm actively looking at getting community members involved in future videos like this for that very reason. So keep it cute and keep it classy. I've gone with the protagonists from the numbered games only, but with one exception because I feel they're particularly noteworthy. But if you have any other spin-off protagonists you think deserve to be higher on this list, like Zack or even someone like Jack Garland, feel free to say so in the comments. And of course, if you enjoy this type of video, do let me know. I've actually been asked a fair few times to make more videos like this and haven't done so in a while, so likes, subscribes, etc. are very much appreciated, whether it be here on YouTube or over on Twitch or TikTok. And with that, let's get started. And where better to start than the very beginning? The only one of the characters on this list that's released before I was born, Warrior of Light of Final Fantasy I fame, released in 1987, is the hallmark of what Final Fantasy has come to represent. The Warrior of Light isn't particularly noteworthy for his story, his lore, his world building, anything like that, but the design of the Warrior of Light is iconic. And it's because of this iconography that I actually hold Warrior of Light in extremely high regard. He's an icon, he's a design, he's a representation of the franchise. It's not about his lore, his world building, or his background. It's just the look. Warrior of Light is Final Fantasy. Without Warrior of Light, there is nothing that came after him. But of course, there isn't an awful lot to talk about with Warrior of Light beyond his design and the fact that he is this representation of Final Fantasy. So while he might be one of my favourite characters, I think a lot of people would put him pretty low on this list. But I'm actually going to go against the grain here, and I'm actually going to put him in A tier, just because of the fact that, like I said, without Warrior of Light, there is no Final Fantasy. So then we move on to Final Fantasy II and Firion. Now, Firion is a little bit of a nothing character, much like Final Fantasy II is amongst the Final Fantasy pantheon. Outside of his role as a rebel against Emperor Matthias's army in Final Fantasy II, there really isn't an awful lot to talk about with this character at all. His design is cool, much like any other Amano designed for Final Fantasy characters, but he doesn't have an awful lot going on for him beyond that. His whole thing is that he's good at using weapons. Like, he doesn't have anything particularly interesting beyond that. There's nothing outwardly wrong with him though, so I wouldn't say he was a terrible character. I just don't think he's particularly remarkable either. And so for that reason, I'm pretty happy to just put him in shrug tier. Like, I wouldn't say he was outright terrible, he's just a bit nothing. Now, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here with Final Fantasy III, and I'm actually going to give it two different entries, because I think that the fact you have Onion Knight and then Luneth as two different characters actually puts them in two different tiers. I would argue that the Onion Knight is one of the weakest protagonists Final Fantasy's ever had. He's like Warrior of Light, except without any of the iconography or the history. He just has not a lot going for him. He's very plain. He introduces the job system, but that's more a hallmark of the game than the character, and he just has no plot really whatsoever. The plot of Final Fantasy III tends to revolve around the world it's based in, rather than the characters that are involved. They are meant as avatars, which is a good thing, except when you're ranking protagonists against one another. Design-wise, Onion Knight is fine. Obviously, he's meant to be a lot younger looking than Warrior of Light. He's meant to be a bit more sprightly than Warrior of Light, certainly in the Dissidia games, but in his original game, he's meant as a nothing character, so I just can't really put him particularly high on this list. And evidently, Square Enix felt the same way about Onion Knight, because when Final Fantasy III was remade for the DS, it changed the characters altogether. They weren't the Onion Knights anymore. They were Luneth, Arc, Refia, and Ingus. So, Luneth, they try and infuse a bit more personality and at least differentiate him from the Onion Knight by changing his design slightly, but I still think he's a bit of a nothing character. So when it comes to actually putting them in a tier list, I'd say that they're some of the weakest there. Luneth, I'm going to put in C tier, because at least they tried to make him differentiated from the other characters in the game and infuse a bit of personality into him. But much like Firion, he just kind of there. Onion Knight, though, I'm actually going to put in D tier. Not for any other reason than he is designed not to really be a character, and as I said earlier, He's Warrior of Light, but without the iconography and the history, so he's just kind of there. So now with Final Fantasy IV, now we're talking. Now we're starting to get some of the characters that have actual backstories, actual plot behind them, and we're starting with a great one in Cecil. Cecil, as of now, isn't particularly groundbreaking, but you've got to remember that back in the 90s, characters like Cecil didn't really exist all that much in video games. To have a character that starts on a darker path and then redeem themselves was considered more groundbreaking back then, and he does it really well. It helps that Cecil's design, both as Dark Knight Cecil and as Paladin Cecil, are both pretty iconic. They look fantastic, they hold up really well to this day, and he's just a great character to look at. I mean, Final Fantasy IV's story was pretty heavily alluded to in Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker, pretty heavily throughout, and Cecil's story was translated pretty heavily into another character, so that goes to show a hallmark as to why he's still worthy nowadays. If anything, I'd say the weakest aspect of Cecil is how he performs in battle. Compared to most other characters in Final Fantasy IV, Cecil's actually pretty weak. This is, however, somewhat addressed in the 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV, certainly with access to things like augments and the ability to change characters' skill set from what they start with as a default. Cecil still isn't the best character in the game, not by a long shot, but he is significantly better, so I think that has some points towards his favour. Now, do I think that Cecil deserves to be our first S-tier character? I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say no. Like, he is very cool and he deserves to be high on this list. And I know that Warrior of Light is as high as he is, and a lot of people will probably disagree with me on that, but that's a personal bias thing. Cecil's just really good all around, but is he the most memorable character on this list? I don't think so, so I'm quite happy to put him in A tier. Bartz and Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V is one of my favourite games in the entire series, but let's be realistic, the story and the characters are not the reason why. Final Fantasy V is very focused on its gameplay, the refinement of the job system, and just fleshing out combat mechanics that Final Fantasy IV was setting up. Bartz is a very mediocre character. Like, he has his pros, like his connection with chocobos like Boko are really cool. He's a lot more light-hearted than a lot of characters, but what he has in light-heartedness and whimsy, he lacks in depth, and not a lot of the game really explores his character. Of course, that's not to say that Bartz has no character. He has a tragic backstory with his parents when you visit the town of Lix, but that's kind of it. Like, beyond that, he's there to be funny, he's there to be silly, and that's very unusual for a Final Fantasy protagonist, and it does mean that he's quite surface level in comparison to a lot of others. In terms of power, he's no different really from any of the other characters in Final Fantasy V, and I try to keep any kind of power scaling to the games in which they come from, otherwise that's an entire whole different discussion that I don't want to get into. But I find that Bartz is just another character much like Luneth and Firion. They serve more as the avatar for the player than they do their own characters, and so for that reason, I'm pretty happy to put Bartz in C tier. This then brings us to Final Fantasy VI. Now, Final Fantasy VI's story was groundbreaking when it was released, and its cast of characters is a major reason as to why. Terra, the character that you start the game with, one could even argue that she's not the main character of the story. That mantle could go to Celes, it could go to Locke. I think that realistically Final Fantasy VI's biggest strength is the fact that it has such a strong ensemble cast, and each character individually does have their time to shine. But because of that, each individual character doesn't shine brighter than any other, and I think it speaks to the volumes of strength that Final Fantasy VI's entire ensemble cast has, that Terra is just another character in the list, and she's still a really good one, but is she one of the most iconic protagonists that Final Fantasy's ever had? Is Celes? Is Locke? Of course, Terra's story has some real highlights in it. The first time that she becomes an Esper, understanding her heritage being the daughter of Madouine. Then having her story arc in Moblis, where she has lost the will to fight and has to regain it in order to protect the children that she's come to adopt in the world of Ruin. There's a lot to love about Terra, but I don't think that she stands out any more than, say, Celes, who has that cliff scene, and you know the one I mean. Terra does, however, also stand out as one of the very few female protagonists in Final Fantasy history. There actually aren't very many of them at all, and I do think that she is very strong. I wouldn't put her above Cecil necessarily, and my horrendous bias for Warrior of Light, but she's definitely one of the most solid characters out there, so I would put her in a very solid B tier, possibly A tier. And then, of course, we come to Final Fantasy VII. Cloud is the icon he is for a reason. Final Fantasy VII put Final Fantasy on the map for a lot of people, and a big part of that is due to Cloud. His iconography with the Buster Sword, Omni Slash, the way he fights, that spiky hair, everyone knows who Cloud is, and there's a good reason for it. I think we live in a time where it's almost cool to hate on Final Fantasy VII because so many people love it, but one has to ask themselves how Final Fantasy VII became the icon it is today, why Final Fantasy VII specifically has the remake trilogy, has so much more expansion on it than any other Final Fantasy in the franchise. Cloud is a big part of it. His story arc is very memorable. He goes through essentially PTSD. He has a lot of very human traits. He also appeals to the fantastical in a way a lot of characters don't. He's an icon, and I think he belongs to be pretty much at the top of this list, if not one of them at the very least. I do think that Cloud's placement on this tier list is going to depend and shift potentially depending on how part 3 of the remake trilogy goes, because there are certain other characters if they were on this list, and, you know, little preview, I'm going to be making a similar list for antagonists, and one of them has shifted somewhat because of the remake trilogy. I'm still going to put Cloud in S tier. I'm sorry. I know that people will probably disagree and think it's cool to hate on Cloud and Final Fantasy VII. I don't, and it's not even my favourite Final Fantasy. I just think that he's made such an impact on the gaming world for his characterization, his design, the way he plays, the way he looks, the way his story plays out. He deserves to be that high. And now for the one spin-off title I've allowed myself within this video, Final Fantasy Tactics. And yes, this is partly because Final Fantasy Tactics The Evil East Chronicles is in the near future, but I want to talk about Ramza. Ramza Beyoulve, and the rest of Final Fantasy Tactics for that matter, is some of the best writing I've ever seen in a video game, and I think it would be criminal not to mention Ramza in this list. I mean, there's also Delita to talk about. Whether you consider him a protagonist of that game is another matter, but we can talk about that more after Final Fantasy Tactics re-releases, because for me, Delita would sit above literally everybody else on this list, but he's technically not the protagonist, so we're gonna go with Ramza here. I truly believe that at the center of Ramza's character, more than any other Final Fantasy character in existence, is love. Ramza is a character that is thrust into some terrible circumstances. He is born into privilege, but that doesn't serve him well as his life goes on, and as you will see through playing Final Fantasy Tactics, the ways in which he navigates everything that happens around him, both politically and with the supernatural, Ramza always comes back to wanting to see the good in everything around him, and he continues to do that right the way to the end of the game. And I think that makes him very admirable and relatable as a character, and honestly, someone to aspire to. So I'm sorry, I know I'm only putting one spin-off character in this list, but I have to put Ramza up there in S tier. In terms of writing, I think he's better than Cloud. In fact, I think he's better than practically everybody on this list. I genuinely adore Ramza and Final Fantasy Tactics, so I had to put it in this video. So then we have a character I'd consider to be one of the more contentious characters on this list, which is Squall. Squall's a character a lot of people like to write off because he's just an edgy teenager, right? But so is a lot of characters in Final Fantasy and JRPGs, so I think that Squall actually epitomizes that trope of character very well, and he actually does know how to have a lot of fun that you perhaps wouldn't expect him to have. Design-wise, I'd argue that Squall is one of the most iconic characters in Final Fantasy. Everyone knows the scar, everyone knows what the gunblade looks like. In fact, I don't think he's that far behind Cloud for being recognizable from the franchise at the very least. If anything, I think it's kind of sad that we didn't get Final Fantasy VIII in its original form. So for those of you that perhaps don't know, Final Fantasy VIII was originally designed to be a much bigger game than it actually is, where you'd have two protagonists, which were Squall and Laguna. Laguna's role in Final Fantasy VIII was originally going to be so much bigger than it ended up being, and so you'd have these two concurrent timelines constantly flashing back and forward between the two. But that didn't happen, so we got the way Final Fantasy VIII is now, so we still see a lot of that in Laguna, but to have seen him be an actual protagonist rather than a side character with a bit more backstory would have been cool. So I think Squall is a solid character. I wouldn't say he's one of the greats, and I'm not sure I would say he was up there with the likes of Cloud and Ramza despite his recognizability, because he is an edgy teenager. Like, he is that way, and his story does take quite a while to kick off, and he kind of bulldozes his own game, because if you're not named Squall or Renoa, you basically get no screen time, and that bothers me. So despite the fact that he is quite so heavily featured in Final Fantasy VIII, I'd say he's a solid main character. I wouldn't say he was the best. Now, I can't talk about Final Fantasy without talking about Final Fantasy IX, and Zidane is a very big part of what makes Final Fantasy IX as strong as it is. The character exemplifies positivity. I think there's a trend in characters I really like in Final Fantasy. It's the ones that tend to lean on relying on their positive traits to get them through negative situations, like Ramza. Cloud is an icon, but he doesn't necessarily do that. He does the opposite and he shuts down entirely, whereas characters like Ramza and Zidane, of course, are constantly trying to see the good in everything that goes on around them. However, I think the turning point for Zidane in what makes him such a powerful character in terms of evoking emotions and just being really well written is the point at which he breaks, which is when he goes to Terra and when he discovers his true identity, etc. And you have the entire Not Alone scene. Again, much like Terra, this is more exemplary of the ensemble cast of Final Fantasy IX, but Zidane is still the centrifugal point to progress the story in this instance. I also think Zidane is one of the characters that's best represented in games outside of Final Fantasy IX. Now, I know I normally talk about them just within the confines of their own game, but take this cutscene from Dissidia NT, for example. You have Terra and Zidane talking to Rama, just like he did in Final Fantasy IX with Garnet, but instead utilizing another character that would have an affinity for that. And I think that utilization does speak volumes to the strength of Zidane's character. And yet, maybe that's why I consider him to be one of the strongest main characters, or protagonists. I just think he's playful, he's whimsical, but he is serious when it matters, he's caring, he's loving. Just look at literally any cutscene in Final Fantasy IX that Zidane has alongside Vivi, and the ending to that game, even his relationship with the villain, Kuja, is sympathetic, and he tries really hard to see the best in him despite all the crazy things that he does. So I personally would put him as an S tier character. I'd be curious to see if other people felt differently. Now, I've said for many a year that Final Fantasy X is the one Final Fantasy game I always recommend to someone who's never played a Final Fantasy game before, and Tidus is a big reason for why. I'm not the biggest fan of Tidus's design, and certainly not in the games outside of Final Fantasy X where he's gotten spikier for some reason, but I do think that his personality is very relatable for a lot of people, much like the characters I've mentioned before, like Ramza and Zidane. He is very much leaning on the positivity side of things, and that I really very much enjoy, with one scene in particular that I think elevates Tidus to a whole new level, and it's one a lot of people tend to, well, laugh at these days. The laughing scene in Final Fantasy X is often met with meme culture, people mocking it, people saying it's poorly done, that it makes no sense, etc. But I beg to differ. I think that the laughing scene in Final Fantasy X is what cements Tidus as a great character in Final Fantasy. He's there to try to distract Yuna from feeling all the things that she'd be feeling on this pilgrimage that's ultimately not going to end very well for her. He knows that it's difficult, she knows that it's difficult, and he's establishing this relationship with Yuna to try and make it so that everything's just a little bit easier for her. Fighting pain with humor. However, I would argue that Tidus isn't one of the single strongest protagonists Final Fantasy's ever had, because without Yuna, Tidus' story is significantly less interesting. Yuna is as much the protagonist of Final Fantasy X as he is, as is evident by the fact that she took over from him in FF10 too. And I think the real character in Final Fantasy X is the relationship between the two. So, do I think that Tidus is a great character? Absolutely. Do I think he stands on his own as one of the best characters or protagonists that Final Fantasy's ever had? I'm not so sure. So for that reason, love Tidus. I'd be very tempted to put him in S tier, but I think he's just a very slight notch under that. So I'm gonna put him in A tier, but that could easily be changed with your comments. So if you tell me why he should be in S tier without Yuna, I'd love to hear it. So now we get into murkier territory with Final Fantasy XI. Now Final Fantasy XI is a weird one because there is a representative from FF11 that's used in other games like the mobile titles or Dissidia, etc. to showcase a protagonist for Final Fantasy XI, but I don't really think she is the protagonist for that game. Now don't get me wrong, Shantotto is an amusing character. She's fun, she's crazy, she's angry, she's extremely powerful, but she's no protagonist for Final Fantasy XI. But therein lies the issue with the MMORPGs, and obviously we'll get to this with 14 as well. You are the main character for Final Fantasy XI and 14. That's kind of the point, and so the direction that your story takes is entirely down to you, and the story is going to be different for every person involved. So to call Shantotto the protagonist of Final Fantasy XI, despite the fact that she's not in half of it, just feels a little bit disingenuous and weird. So for that reason, I'm gonna put her in D tier, not because I think she's a terrible character, just because I think it's strange that she's given the mantle of protagonist in a game in which she's not one. Okay, so let's move on to Final Fantasy XII, and let's talk about Vaan. I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that Vaan is one of the most disliked protagonists in Final Fantasy history, and I can absolutely see why. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy XII's storytelling methods are done a bit differently. I've always argued that the main character of Final Fantasy XII isn't Vaan, or Ash, or Balthier, or any of the main characters in fact. I'd say if anyone, it's Rabanasta. But let's be honest, me waxing lyrical about the politics and the ethics behind Final Fantasy XII storytelling isn't going to get us anywhere when it comes to rating Vaan as a protagonist. And I think the reason that a lot of people don't like Vaan is because, like Onion Knight and Warrior of Light, he's kind of an avatar for the player, like you're meant to see the world through his eyes. But differently from those two, he is given a personality and supposed to be presented as a protagonist. I actually don't think that Vaan is that bad a character in that he does serve the purpose he's meant to within Final Fantasy XII. However, as far as like the power fantasy goes and the player wanting to kind of imprint on the character, I do find that Vaan has a tendency to come off as whiny and irritating rather than positive, which is the energy that he's supposed to be bringing. And so for that reason, I do understand why he's not liked, and so to kind of put him up against like the likes of Squall, Zidane, Ramza, etc., he's nowhere near any of those guys. And I would definitely not say he's as strong as Squall or Terra either. So I think we're going to have to put him in C tier, and I think that's probably fair for him, right? So then we move on to Final Fantasy XIII and Lightning. By the way, a lot of the footage that I'm going to use for Lightning is going to come from Dissidia, because for some reason YouTube is very strange about using Final Fantasy XIII footage. A lot of people really like to put Lightning at the top of all kind of power creep lists when it comes to Final Fantasy, and I kind of love that for her, but I want to try and keep this list grounded in terms of why I like these characters or dislike them, and I genuinely think that Lightning is a very well-written character. She goes through a wider range of experiences, emotions, even just within Final Fantasy XIII itself, and I think that that gives her a lot to root for. Lightning from a design perspective is also a really great character. She's fairly simplistic compared to a lot of other characters on this list, but she also was a supermodel for Louis Vuitton and Prada amongst other things and crossed over into the real world in ways that a lot of characters could only dream of. And she's just stood the test of time. The Blazefire Saber is pretty iconic. She's done very well within sort of games and other media outside of Final Fantasy. She's just a very likable character. Well, I certainly think so at least. I know a lot of people like to put Final Fantasy XIII's cast of characters towards the lower end of the list, and I can understand why they'd say that, but Lightning in particular, I definitely say, is a shining example of one of the best characters from the FF13 franchise. Is she as good as Zidane, Ramza, or Cloud? No, I don't think so, but I would put her above a lot of the others, so I'm actually going to put Lightning in A tier. I think she's very well written. I do think she gets away with it because there have been a lot more games that feature her than a lot of the other characters on this list, but that is part of the reason that she's up in that list. She's just had more time to blossom than a lot of the others. Final Fantasy XIV, much like Final Fantasy XI, doesn't really have a protagonist, and yet it likes to push a particular character as the protagonist. And I don't agree with this, even with the character they've chosen to represent Final Fantasy XIV, which is a very strange thing to say. Now please don't get it twisted, I adore Y'shtola. Y'shtola is a fantastically written character, she's lovable, she's serious when it counts, but she has all the sass that she could possibly need. And I have a lot of time for her, but she's definitely not the protagonist of Final Fantasy XIV. If anything, if any of the characters or the NPCs in Final Fantasy XIV should be the representative for it as a protagonist, I don't think it's Y'shtola. If anyone, I think it's Alphinaud. Alphinaud is way more present throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV from start to finish, from Realm Reborn all the way up to Dawn Trail. Alphinaud is just way more featured as a character than Y'shtola is. But I'd still say that that was incorrect, because much like Final Fantasy XI, the character that's the protagonist for Final Fantasy XIV is you. And so, for that reason, and not for any hate towards Y'shtola herself, because I love Y'shtola, she's going in the bottom tier. And the only reason for that is because she's featured as a protagonist in a game in which she's not one. Moving into Final Fantasy XV now, Noctis is a character that I feel had a lot more potential than we got as payoff, but he's still a very good character. Of course, when we were first introduced to Noctis many years ago, we were introduced to him as the protagonist for a different game entirely. It was supposed to be Final Fantasy Versus 13, which then morphed into Final Fantasy 15 over the course of time. And I think that with the troubled development that Final Fantasy 15 had, especially with the way everything ended and us not really getting the full ending and having to read it in a book, we never got to see Noctis' full potential. Noctis' relationships with other characters is really intriguing, and I do like Noctis from a design perspective, and a lot of people actually like Noctis more than you might think. FF15 in general is actually one of the most popular Final Fantasies out there, probably due to its release timing. It's been forgotten a little bit more over the course of time, certainly over the last few years, but at the time of its release, Noctis was exceptionally popular, and I think his design and his low-key outfits and the way that he looks is a big part of that. I definitely wouldn't put Noctis in C tier, or certainly not D tier, but I don't think that he's up there with a lot of the greats out there, so I'm going to say he's pretty solidly in B tier. Which of course brings us to the newest member of the Final Fantasy protagonist family, Clive from Final Fantasy XVI. Now, I'm sure I'm not alone in having opinions about Final Fantasy XVI, whether it be its pacing, whether it be the fact that it's not really a Final Fantasy, which is still an argument I've never fully understood. But I think there's something that we can all pretty much agree on, and that it's Clive's a pretty great character. I think because we get to see so much of Clive's life, from his youth to his young adulthood to him being older as a character, the storytelling methods present in Final Fantasy XVI actually do a lot to aid Clive as a character, and they flesh him out beautifully. Design-wise, Clive is very good. Obviously his voice acting is extraordinary. We all know that Ben Starr does an amazing job with Clive, and it's made him a household name, amongst obviously all of his other feats, but Clive, just as a character by himself, does stand well on his own. It's just a shame that the said can't be said for a lot of the rest of Final Fantasy XVI's cast, because a lot of them don't get to see their full potential, probably in sacrifice for aiding Clive's character development. But that all being said, I think the fact that Clive kind of ate everybody else's character development in Final Fantasy XVI did serve him very well, and for that reason I would argue that he is probably up there as an S-tier character, and I'd be curious to see if anybody disagreed with that. I'm not sure if he'll stand the test of time the same way that characters like Cloud, Zidane and Ramza have, but I think he could, even if the game he comes from doesn't. So yeah, taking a second look at this list, I'm pretty happy with where I've placed everybody. I'm pretty sure that judging by the way other people would look, I think a lot of people would put Warrior of Light lower, and I totally understand why, even if I wouldn't. I think a lot of people would probably put Terra higher, And I think a lot of people would put Shantotto and Ishtola higher, but I have my reasons as to why they are where they are on this list, even if it's nothing to do with their actual characterization. There you have it. That's my tier list for the protagonists of Final Fantasy. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, especially for characters I have not put on this list. And watch this space, because there's another list that needs to be made to mirror this one, and I'd love for you guys to be involved. I should be putting that list on my Discord server, which is linked below, and I encourage you to show me how you would rank the antagonists of Final Fantasy. And we'll be making that video next week. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Do subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it. I haven't posted to YouTube in quite some time, as other platforms have kind of bulldozed me, but I think that I could really get into making more tier list videos, not just for Final Fantasy, but for other franchises as well. And so I'd love to hear your comments on what else you'd like to see done like this. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next time. Take care.